A great trio can be one of the most entertaining things to watch in wrestling. Just look at acts like The New Day or The Shield if you need any evidence of this. That said, not all three-man units are created equal, and for every great one out there, there's just as many who never really met up with expectations. But what are the worst examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And as always, if we're going to start somewhere, let's do so with a prominent example of this phenomenon, as when you think of bad three-man teams, it's hard for your mind not to go quickly to XFactor. Yes, few acts were more hated by fans at the turn of the millennium than this X-Pac-led group, as aside from having the worst entrance music known to man, it was also a group being led by Sean Waltman. And given how much he was despised by audiences at the time then, so much so that the term X-Pac Heat had to be created to describe it, it meant anything he was involved in was going to sink like a lead balloon. Not that this meant the group weren't talented though. No, aside from their leaders' excellent in-ring skills, they also had the work of Just Incredible and Albert to prop them up. The only problem was none of this mattered in fans' eyes. Hell, it could have been Bryan Danielson, Bret Hart, and Kurt Angle in the ring, and they'd still have hated them just purely on account of who was at the head of the table. So because of that, any plans there may have been to push X-Factor quickly got dropped, as the faction soon morphed into more of a mid-card act. Yes, they would pick up wins as a trio, and both X-Pac and Albert would become singles champions during their run together, but it never felt like they were a real threat to anyone of any particular note. Perhaps it's a mercy in that case then that once the match-aligned invasion angle began in July of 2001, Credible would jump ship to the side of the heels as he reunited with his old ECW buddies, leaving his now former stablemates high and dry. And while they would attempt to continue on as a tag team for a while after that, by then, the writing was on the wall, and so following an injury picked up by Sean Waltman in October, one of the worst trios of all time quietly faded away into history. And the only reason we say one of the worst here is because, for as bad as X-Factor were, they still may not be the bottom of the barrel. Hell, they may not even be the weakest threesome out of the Attitude Era. No, for this honor, we have to look a little bit earlier, namely 1999, as that was when the Mean Street Posse first debuted. Of course, part of the reason this one was so terrible was because two of the group's members weren't even wrestlers. No, when it came to Rodney and Pete Gas, they were just old high school friends of Shane McMahon. So when Shane O'Mac turned heel and decided that he needed a crew around him to protect him from harm, he figured the easiest way to get heat from fans would be to have his backup come in the form of a couple of preppy rich kids with no business being in the ring. To be fair though, this did work, as fans immediately hated the Mean Street Posse and everything they represented. And they hated it even more so once Joey Abs, a journeyman indie wrestler, was also added to the stable in order to have someone who could take bumps in the ring. But then it's hard not to hate a group who present themselves as being from the tough streets of Greenwich, Connecticut, and who clearly hadn't had to work a day in their lives. Still, even for as much resentment as they received, it soon became clear this wasn't an act that was going to be able to hold its own in the ring. After all, need we remind you that 66% of them weren't actual wrestlers. So because of this, they eventually began slipping down into the role of being undercard jobbers, usually getting beat up by whoever Shane was feuding with that month. And when they weren't doing this, they'd largely be either in the hardcore title division trying and failing to outsmart Crash Holly, or having a brief feud with then tag team champions Edge and Christian, which saw the heels get punked out in record time. That said, it could have been worse, because at least they got TV time past a certain point, the same of which couldn't be said for our next subject, PMS. Yeah, we're still not done with terrible Attitude Era trios yet, because now it's time to look at one which was built by women. In fact, that's where the name of the group came from, with PMS being short for Pretty Mean Sisters. But that was far from the worst thing about this often forgotten three-women unit, as aside from their awful name, they were also involved in some of the worst angles and segments of the era. Basically, it all started in November of 1998 when Jacqueline, then manager of Mark Marrow, decided she'd had enough of him and so found a new family for herself with Terry Runnels, someone who was also going through issues with their client and real-life husband Goldust at the time. And once they were together then, they decided they wanted to take their vengeance out on all the men of WWF, with their first target being Val Venus. Unfortunately though, this led to an angle which was tasteless even by the standards of the 90s, when Terry claimed the Big Valboski had gotten her pregnant. And when Venus refuted this by delivering the all-timer of a line, "I had a vasectomy," both the pregnant woman and her partner only got angrier, with this leading to them recruiting D'Lo Brown and Mark Henry to help them destroy their foe. But even that wouldn't be the nadir of the whole thing, as it turned out, because during the series of matches which followed, Terry accidentally got knocked off the ring apron by D'Lo one night, and as a result, claimed to have suffered a miscarriage. Yeah, it was pretty awful on every level, and all of this was before their third member, Ryan Shamrock, even came on board. Not that it was any better once she did arrive though, as the now 3-woman unit here procured a love slave in the form of Meat. And at this point, the story shifted to the idea that Terry was having an excessive amount of alone time with the big man before his matches, leading him to get too tired to compete properly. So because of this, internal frustrations between the women began to grow, and pretty soon thereafter, they'd have split. Was this a suitably terrible way to end such an awful stable? Yes. That said, it still doesn't compare to the abrupt way our next trio flamed out, and that was the union of the Hardy Boys and Michael Hayes. Yes, it's hard to think of two things that go together less than Doc Hendricks and Team Extreme. And that's why it immediately looked so jarring when the brothers started coming to the ring in the autumn of 1998 in their traditional ring gear, all while someone who looked like their dad followed along close by whilst wearing baggy pants and carrying a cane. Yes, it's true the Hardys did taste their first successes during this period, such as when they defeated the Acolytes to briefly become the tag team champions. But that was more down to them than their manager. In fact, if anything, their association with Hayes threatened to drag them down at this point. Why was that? Well, no one wanted to see the brother duo partnering up with an old guy who had nothing in common with them. It all just made them seem a little less cool. So thankfully, they'd figure this out before things got too late when in August of 1999, Matt and Jeff dumped Hayes in favor of Gangrel. And sure, this trio wasn't much better, but at least it did eventually serve as the final step before we'd get to the true Team Extreme in 2000, the one which included Lita. But while the Hardys can be thankful they got the opportunity to reinvent themselves with new friends until things worked out right, not every trio can say the same thing. No, most are stuck with the original members they're given. And when those 3 members are Stardust and the Ascension, it was never going to lead to anything good for the Cosmic Wasteland. But wait, we hear you say, Cody Rhodes is awesome. After all, he's the guy who helped to start AEW, and since then has gone on to become arguably WWE's biggest babyface star. Well, yes, that is true, but back in the mid-2010s, things were not looking so rosy for the American Nightmare. Why was that? Well, it was then he was stuck with the infamous Stardust gimmick, basically the scrappy do to Goldust's Scooby. And because he was doing everything he could just to try and not make this one suck, it meant Cody didn't have a chance to let his true potential shine. So you think the least the WWE could have done here would have been to throw him a bone and give him a good angle to sink his teeth into? Sadly though, good angles and latter-day Vince McMahon booking aren't exactly two things which go hand in hand, and so instead of getting a notable story, Cody got 2 new partners in the form of the Ascension. Now the Ascension, well, not exactly great, were a fine undercard tag team act for the time, as they basically served as a nostalgic throwback to old 80s teams such as the Road Warriors. That said, by pairing them up with Stardust at this point, it felt like management were basically telling the grandson of a plumber that he had no future with the company other than to be a wacky cartoon heel who was never going to even sniff the main event scene. Was this what led to Cody leaving the company altogether soon thereafter and going on a career-redefining journey through the indies? It almost certainly contributed towards his decision. Hell, it wasn't as if the Cosmic Wasteland ever did anything more notable than fighting Neville and the Lucha Dragons on the 2015 Night of Champions pre-show anyway. And it wasn't like WWE had any plans for Connor and Victor after their third man was gone, as at this point, they just returned to the undercard from whence they came. So we guess it's safe to say it worked out in the end, and it's for the best Cosmic Wasteland never hung around for the long haul, just as it's for the best our next terrible trio went their own ways and found individual success too. Who are we talking about here? Why, 3MB of course. That's right, it's strange to think back on now, but back in 2012, Drew McIntyre was firmly rooted in the jobber end of the WWE roster. And this was only further emphasized in September of that year when he was placed into a stable with Heath Slater and Jinder Mahal named the 3-Man Band. Why was such a move a kiss of death? Well, because this trio were the ultimate set of losers on both the SmackDown and Raw rosters at the time. In fact, despite being made up of 3 very competent wrestlers, they rarely got a win on TV. Rather, most of their time would be taken up with them getting involved in comedy segments, like the time they tried to sing at a karaoke bar and ended up getting thrown out for their troubles. And even when they were picking up the occasional victory, it wasn't as if it was coming at the expense of anyone higher up on the food chain. No, it would usually be other comedy figures such as Santino Marella or R-Truth who fell to them, letting each fan in attendance know just where they stood. So when the group disbanded in June of 2014 then, once Drew and Jinder were released from their contracts, most assumed that it would be the final chapter in the 3MB story. But in a strange twist, their legacy continues to live on in the most unlikely of ways today, as both the Scotsman and the Canadian have since made their triumphant returns to New York and each become WWE champion. Sure, Heath Slater still has to reach that level himself, but given how crazy wrestling has been over the last few years, we wouldn't be surprised if he wins the big one too as well at some point. And if he ever did, it would give this group the distinction of being the only jobber stable in history to be filled with nothing but world champions. One trio who certainly can't say they're filled with world champions though comes from late period WCW. And given how bad that whole time was, the fact that 3 count still stands out is a testament to just how bad they were. But let's backtrack for a second to get a reminder of just who exactly this trio were. Basically, it goes back to December of 1999, when in an attempt to capitalize on the boy band craze of the time, Jimmy Hart decided he wanted to create his own wrestling version. So quickly scouring the roster for any potential musical recruits, he soon fell upon the 3 men who he felt would make him his fortune, with these 3 being none other than Shane Helms, Shannon Moore, and Evan Courageous. Once they were selected then, the Mouth of the South set to work on creating a hit single for them named Can't Get You Out of My Heart, a song which would first be introduced to fans through a series of pre-taped vignettes. And of course, given the makeup of the WCW audience at the time, it should come as no surprise this quickly led to 3 count being so hated they couldn't go anywhere without being booed. Not that such a reaction slowed them down though. No, if anything, it just fueled the trio to go even further, as after that, they'd start performing lip-synced renditions of their song in the middle of the ring each week. And when they weren't doing that, they were even having the occasional match, with this leading them at one point to becoming the joint hardcore champion together. How exactly did 3 men become a champion simultaneously? Well, that's a long story we don't really have time to get into right now. What we'll focus on instead is the fact that there actually was briefly a 4th member of 3 count, as in mid-2000, former MMA fighter Tank Abbott actually joined the group for a time too. Unfortunately for him though, his run with the wrestling boy band wouldn't last for long because by the end of that year, a series of big losses saw the 3 original members start to come to blows. And this led to Courageous being given the boot from the group not long after, with such a move officially ending their time together as a trio. Needless to say then, fans were happy to see this one die as it had never been a hit with them in the first place. But that's not to say all bad trios are hated in the same way. No, sometimes they inexplicably manage to get over with at least one audience. And if you need any evidence of that, you only have to look at the Blue World Order's time in ECW. Now for some context, this was a group who started out as a one-night parody, so it was never really meant to last in the long term. Basically, the way it came about was that after seeing the success of the NWO over in WCW, Stevie Richards, the Blue Meanie, and Nova all decided to have some fun with it by doing their own version up in Philadelphia. And that's what led to November to Remember 1996, where the 3 came out to the ring dressed as Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Hollywood Hogan, with them changing their names slightly to represent the Meanies' favorite color as they became the BWO instead. Was it all a little bit silly? Sure, but it was never meant to be anything else. And so much fun did the threesome end up having with it that they continued to run with the act over the next couple of years, with them at one point even introducing their own version of Blue World Order Japan. That said, for some fans it remained a little too stupid, and so they couldn't bring themselves to get behind it. But even if we do admit it veered a little too close towards sucking at times, there was a lot of fun to be had with the antics of Big Stevie Cool, the Blue Guy, and Hollywood Nova anyway, when they really let themselves go wild with the concept. It's just a shame the same can't be said for our next NWO-themed subject then, because when this one came about in 2010 TNA, it didn't matter how much nostalgia fans had for the once mighty supergroup, there was just no getting behind the band. Who were the band? Well, they were Eric Bischoff's latest attempt to get some more milk out of the New World Order cash cow, when after joining up with TNA at the start of the decade, he decided what the challenger brand to WWE really needed wasn't to try and be different. No, it was to play off of the nostalgia of the past. And that was how, after Kevin Nash made some less than subtle hints about getting the band back together in January of that year, he appeared on an episode of Impact and introduced two new signings to the company, Scott Hall and Sean Waltman. Yeah, it was the NWO Revival no one wanted, as each of the men involved were a lot older now and a lot less mobile than they had been in the 90s. Of course, despite being on the TNA roster at the time, this time Hulk Hogan would not take part in the angle, perhaps because he realized how terrible it all was. And that only served to further highlight how limp this trio was, as they couldn't even get their most famous member to join. But what about their actual matches? Surely they were okay at least? Well, no, because again, this was Nash, Hall, and Waltman at a much different stage in their lives, so they weren't able to go anywhere near the same level anymore. And that was something evident in their bouts against the likes of Team 3D, as it quickly became apparent for all to see this was one band which should have remained split rather than return for one last tour. Hell, so bad did it get that the trio even eventually started mimicking the problems of late period NWO when they began adding new members in the form of Eric Young, D'Angelo Dinero, and Bubba the Love Sponge. So, thankfully, after that, things didn't last much longer, and by the end of the year, the entire experiment was mercifully put to rest. That said, it wouldn't be the last time TNA suffered from having a pretty terrible trio, because a few years later in 2015, we'd all get to be a witness to the quick rise and fall of The Rising. Ah yes, The Rising. Impact's attempt to elevate the status of Drew Galloway, Micah, and Eli Drake, during the middle of the 2010s, hasn't really been remembered very well. But then there's a good reason for that, because despite the best efforts of both the company and the performers to make it work, it pretty much sucked right out of the gate. Sure, it could have been something had things gone a little differently. After all, the idea of Galloway recruiting two of his friends to help him in his ongoing wars against the Beatdown Clan was certainly an admirable idea. The only problem was that this was about the only thing they ever did of note. That's right, while most stables are able to move on to different feuds following their initial debut, The Rising never really did so. No, pretty much their entire history involves battling it out with MVP Bobby Lashley and Kenny King. And what made things even worse was that despite being the clear babyfaces in the feud, they didn't even come out on top in the end. Rather, they lost the final showdown between the two trios on July 1st of that year, and as a consequence, had to split up for good. Not exactly the makings of a great heroic tale, is it? And this is exactly why no one really talks about them anymore, certainly not in a positive light at least. But it's not all bad, because all three members would go on to greater things once The Rising was mercifully put to rest, with Micah currently working in Japan as former Bullet Club member Tonga Loa, and the rechristened Drew McIntyre and L.A. Knight currently serving as two of the biggest babyface stars on the WWE roster. So I guess it just goes to show that even if you are a part of a terrible trio, it doesn't mean you have to be associated with the team for the rest of your career. No, if you play your cards right, you can get out unscathed and still have a successful run elsewhere.